On January 20th, just a few days ago, Donald Trump left the White House, hopefully for good, and Joe Biden was sworn in as 46th President of the United States of America. Since then, most major news outlets have been singing old Joe's praises, and one must admit Biden has been pretty busy since he took office. He's signed the USA back into the Paris Climate Agreement. He's promised to focus on science, not politics, in the fight against COVID-19. He's canceled the permits for the Keystone Pipeline through Native American land, which was surprising to me. He's halted the construction of the border wall, restored DACA, and ended Trump's travel ban on predominantly Muslim countries. Don't get me wrong, these are all good things. They're great things. They're all incremental steps in the right direction, and I'm certainly glad to see Trump go. But while Biden, the DNC, and most of the media try to convince us that this new administration is going to make America, great again in the wake of Trump's disastrous 4 years in office, I just have to remind you, America was never great. As undeniably positive as these measures Biden has been taking have been, they will not go far enough to actually address the major underlying systemic issues which have been gripping the United States since long before Trump ever took office, since the beginning of the US. And that is key to understand. Trump might have made many of our problems worse, but he certainly didn't make all, not even most of the problems that exist to begin with. The Obama-Biden administration brutally cracked down on protests against police violence in Ferguson. The Obama-Biden administration rounded up immigrants and threw their children in cages. The Obama-Biden administration waged a devastating drone terror campaign in the Muslim world, further destabilizing that region, which was already suffering from centuries of oppression and intervention from colonialist and imperialist powers, including the USA. About 40 prisoners still remain in Guantanamo Bay. Biden hasn't announced any plans to release them. 2.3 million prisoners currently reside in American prisons, the highest rate in the world. And of course, we all know the racial disparities that exist behind bars in America. Even if we have a complete rollout of the COVID-19 vaccine in 2021, even if the death count drops to zero, what about the tens of thousands of Americans who died every year due to lack of healthcare before COVID-19? Even if Biden somehow manages to stave off the massive onslaught of evictions which millions of Americans are facing right now through relief checks or enhanced unemployment benefits or other measures, what about the 500,000 people who had no housing long before Trump stepped into the White House? Okay, look, I'm probably preaching to the choir right now. It's pretty obvious that there are plenty of horrible systemic problems in the USA that go back way before Trump's time. Maybe Biden will be able to restore us to status quo, the situation we were in around the Obama years. But the status quo sucks. Biden doesn't want to rock the boat. He doesn't want to fundamentally change the system of government in the USA. He doesn't want to end any of the exploitative and oppressive and genocidal systems that the United States has pioneered and perpetuates. A lot of leftists think that we can push Biden to the left, force the DNC Congress to usher in universal health care and abolish the police and other such critically needed reforms. But capitalism and the police and the military-industrial complex and all these other intersecting institutions of oppression, as long as they're allowed to exist, the United States will continue to be a force for malevolence and suffering in the USA and around the world. We know that global climate change is a severe and rapidly approaching threat, one that the Paris Agreement could never hope to forestall. Even the Green New Deal would not nearly come close enough to hitting the targets we need to hit to stop climate change and save the planet. And we have a responsibility to every future generation of humanity to save this planet by dismantling the wretched system of greed that is capitalism, which has wreaked havoc on our world through voracious greed for centuries. We have a responsibility to the people in the developing world who are victims of our imperialism. We have a responsibility to ourselves to save our own lives and to build the world which we know we can exist in. And the only way to make these things happen is to do the work of revolution. Now, when I talk about revolution, I always have to make it clear that I'm not talking about armed, violent revolution. I have a whole video on the kinds of strategies I advocate for, including direct action, mutual aid, dual power, militant unionism. And I have to say, I'm proud of the work that was accomplished in 2020 by the left. Millions of Americans risked their lives marching for Black Lives Matter, confronting a completely violent and fascistic police force which brutalized, maimed, and murdered thousands in the public for all to see. At the beginning of 2020, worker strikes were already up 257% over the prior year, and COVID saw workers' councils and IWW chapters and unionizing in general spread across the country. Over 1,000 strikes occurred in the USA in 2020, including the May 1st essential workers strike, which challenged massive corporations like Amazon and Target, and the Juneteenth Longshore Union strike shut down $1 billion in trade along the entire West Coast, though it didn't get very much press coverage at all. All of these displays of courage and willingness to act were encouraging to me, and they should be to you. But we also have to recognize that it's going to take a great deal more effort and a much larger movement to bring about lasting change on the scale we need to liberate ourselves and save the world from the dangers we face. What's required is no less than a complete cultural shift, a massive uprising against capitalism, neoliberalism, fascism, white supremacism, imperialism, and all the other systems that are destroying our Earth. Now I know what you're thinking. The odds seem insurmountable. Such a revolution must be impossible, especially when fascism is at an all-time high as a threat. The police are stronger than ever, and so many of us are in such desperate situations that sustained action seems impossible. There are no easy answers. There's no definite and clear path forward, but nobody else is going to come and rescue us. And it's certain that time is running out. The United States government showed during the BLM uprising that it's willing and capable of fielding terrifying technology and violence against American citizens, including predator drone surveillance, face recognition technology, LRAD sound cannons that cause permanent deafness indiscriminately against crowds, and who knows what's being developed now to use against us in the next uprising. It's probably death robots. The rapid advance of oppression technology, combined with the rapid collapse of our environment, confines us in a situation where we have no choice but to fight to escape. Time is running out. What choice do we have but to struggle for solutions no matter the odds? Doomerism and dismay may seem attractive right now. The lure of giving up hope and giving into despair is real, even for me sometimes. As the French anarchist Albert Libertad wrote, "I wish not to disappear, but to throw upon the scene the light of truth, to provide a disinfectant to it by any means at my command. And if I am destroyed in this effort, I shall not be totally effaced. I shall have reacted against the environment. I shall have lived briefly, but intensely. I shall perhaps have opened a breach for the passage of energies similar to my own." But when a movement like ours is so small, so fledgling, so weak in comparison to the incomprehensible might of the United States of America, where do we even begin? We have plenty of tactics available, like the ones I talked about earlier, but how should we prioritize those actions? What kind of roadmap can we use to make this long, hard journey with any confidence that what we're doing is making a difference? Antonio Gramsci was a communist who pondered this question from a much more desperate situation than you or I likely face. He wrote about leftist political strategy from a prison cell in Mussolini's fascist Italy for over a decade. If you think your situation is hopeless right now, imagine how Gramsci felt, writing in notebooks without a library to reference and no hope of escape. And yet he wrote, he fought in the only way that he could. So let's consider the advice Gramsci has to give. In one of his prison notebook entries, Gramsci compared military conflict to political struggle. Gramsci pointed out that to achieve victory in a military conflict, one side's army simply needs to defeat the army of the other side, and that in some instances, victory can even be achieved by merely having the potential to defeat the enemy army. If your army is much stronger than their army, they might surrender before a battle is even fought. Political struggle, according to Gramsci, is enormously more complex. It can be compared to colonial wars or old wars of conquest, in which the victorious army occupies or proposes to occupy permanently all or part of the conquered territory. Then the defeated army is disarmed and dispersed, but the struggle continues on the terrain of politics. Gramsci also pointed out that revolutionists should not believe that we can simply copy what the ruling class does to suppress us in fighting the ruling class, or we will fall into easy ambushes. He points out that we must never fall into the illusion of believing that we could field a standing army against the ruling class the way that they are able to field armies against us. The class factor leads to a fundamental difference. A class which has to work fixed hours every day cannot have permanent and specialized assault organizations, as can a class which has ample financial resources, and all of those members are not tied down by fixed work. Ultimately, Gramsci concluded that to fix one's mind on the military model is the mark of a fool. Politics must have priority over the military aspect, and only politics create the possibility of maneuver and movement. Gramsci pointed to The General Strike by Rosa Luxemburg as one of the most significant documents theorizing the war of maneuver in relation to political science. Luxemburg identified economic and political crises which occur regularly under capitalism as the field artillery of socialist revolutions. Crisis opens a breach in the enemy's defenses, a breach sufficient for one's own troops to rush in and obtain a definite strategic victory, or at least an important victory in the context of the strategic line. Gramsci wrote that in addition to breaching the defenses of the ruling capitalist class, crisis also motivates people to rapidly organize and fight against existing power structures. In a flash, they organize one's own troops and create the necessary cadres, or at least in a flash, they put the existing cadres formed until that moment by the general historical process, which enabled them to encadre one's scattered forces. And isn't that what we saw in 2020? It may sound cynical, but COVID and the BLM uprising and all the other crises we faced last year did certainly breach some of the defenses of capitalism. They did certainly mobilize millions of people around the world, and they've spurred a lot of us to become politically involved and class conscious, and to begin searching for alternatives to capitalism for the first time in our lives. Gramsci also made important developments in the concept of cultural hegemony. Now, Marx had written about the superstructure of capitalism, which we've covered in videos in the past. Basically, it involves the art, science, religion, and other cultural and social forms of a society on top of the physical structure, which were the means of production, the way that factories worked, the way that the means of production were owned, the way that labor was organized. So Marx believed that the focus should be on attacking the economic means of production, the mode of production. In other words, we should start by attacking capitalism directly and not worry so much about changing the culture. Gramsci pointed out that the capitalist class has made such a strong and powerful cultural hegemony that there's no way to have meaningful class struggle unless we create a counter to that hegemony. We have to create our own counter-hegemony, our own culture, our own socialist culture that people can adopt and use to stand against the capitalist hegemony. Until we can do that, in Gramsci's view, revolution will be impossible in a highly developed capitalist state where cultural hegemony is firmly rooted. Gramsci wrote that we must conduct a war of maneuver against these cultural hegemonies in these highly developed capitalist states, since they provide deep and profound defenses for the ruling class, and that we can't simply rely on crises to do all of the work of revolution for us. The superstructures of civil society are like the trench systems of modern warfare. In war, it would sometimes happen that a fierce artillery attack seemed to have destroyed the enemy's entire defensive system, whereas in fact, it only destroyed the outer perimeter. And at the moment of their advance and attack, the assailants would find themselves confronted by a line of defenses which was still effective. The same thing happens in politics during the great economic crises. A crisis cannot give the attacking forces the ability to organize with lightning speed in time and in space, and less can it endow them with fighting spirit. Similarly, the defenders are not demoralized, nor do they abandon their positions even among the ruins, nor do they lose faith in their own strength or their own future. Which, again, I think is exactly what we are seeing right now. Despite the profound and powerful actions of 2020, the state doesn't seem shaken or fazed or challenged at all. If anything, the media superstructure seems to be further legitimizing the state now that Biden and the Democrats are taking the reins. Though there are still demonstrations and protests in the USA nearly every day, and I don't want to discount them, that's important action, we are not seeing the scale that we saw at the peak of 2020. And work strikes have flagged off as well. There's a real danger that complacency is settling in as Biden begins to lull us back to inaction with false consciousness and hope. And building back that momentum will not be easy. But there's one thing that we can be pretty confident about, and that's that there will be another major crisis, and it will be soon. That's the nature of capitalism, especially these days. It's our job then as revolutionists to take advantage of the next crisis, whatever it might be, the next breach in the defenses of capitalism, to sally forth and attack the superstructure, the cultural hegemony of the ruling class through political maneuver. That's why we need to always be organizing and planning, and this is important, developing our own counter-hegemony, building our own culture, and escaping from, eschewing the capitalist culture that we were all raised in. Because there may be another massive breach at any moment with all the instability inherent in the current phase of capitalism, with all that's happening in the world right now. There will be another breach. We have to be ready for it. And we have to begin spreading and developing and forming our own counter culture to attack and replace the capitalist hegemony. The far right is doing. Look at the Proud Boys, look at the alt-right. They have their own counter-hegemony. They have their own internal culture. We might laugh at the things that the Proud Boys do. We might laugh at the aesthetics. We might not take it seriously. We might think that QAnon is pathetic and obnoxious and just flat out ridiculous. But it is a powerful counter-hegemony. It has lured over a lot of people to the far right. So how do we do this? How do we build a counter-hegemony? Well, throughout 2020, anarchist philosopher and activist Hannibal Shakur has been discussing the ways in which we can attack the hegemonic power of white supremacism, capitalism, Islamophobia, and all these other intersecting forms of oppression, and how we can build our own counter-hegemony. Some of his writing is featured in Rosa Negra's Black Anarchist Reader, and I highly recommend that you all check this document out immediately. It is free online. There's a link in the description. Seriously, read the Black Anarchist Reader. It's got so much perspective in it that we really need right now. Anyway, in the Reader, Shakur has some concrete, pragmatic advice for what our organizing should look like if we are to confront the hegemonic superstructure of capitalist society. If we are to survive this wave of repression, if anarchy is to become a vehicle of the people, we must direct our energy to the new infrastructure. Programs that meet essential needs of the people must meet them with the explanation of why they are necessary. Programs that perpetually treat the symptoms of capitalism without feeding the mental struggle of the people must be replaced by comrades who pull no punches. We must show our friends and our neighbors that nothing can do more for them than they can do for themselves through anarchism. We must show the nonprofits and NGOs whose politics consist of liberal obscurities and multicultural tokenism will not put more food on their table, put more homeless families in clean homes, will not put more police terrorists to an end than anarchism. When people are subjected and oppressed at the level we see today, psychologically and materially, we must orient ourselves to the undoing of that hegemonic hold. We must orient ourselves not to weeding out people, but to weeding out of people injustice and oppression. A lot is going to happen in 2021. We are likely to face crisis after crisis as liberalism and fascism undergo some massive shifts. And the capitalist system continues to churn out crisis after crisis, which we know it will do. But let's take this to heart. Every crisis presents opportunity, but only if we plan, organize, if we prepare, and if we begin presenting our own counter-hegemony. I would submit that this counter-hegemony that we build needs to be built on kindness. It needs to be built on understanding, acceptance, a thorough study of the ways in which oppression intersect, and it needs to be welcoming of many different perspectives and voices. It needs to be inclusive. It needs to be something that lifts people up in these times of terrifying change. And it needs to be rooted in the spirit of from each according to their ability to each according to their need. We need to understand that there are disabled comrades who can't work, who might not be able to participate in a labor-intensive manner, but their lives are just as valuable as ours, and their future is something that we need to consider, and we need to give them a voice. We need to understand that there are a lot of different stakeholders in this revolution. And we might not see eye to eye all the time, and we might not be able to have leftist unity. That's probably a pipe dream, but we can, at the very least, try to learn from each other to the best of our ability. It's not going to be easy to unite the working class in the USA. There are a lot of divisions that have been intentionally placed there by the capitalist class for a very, very long time. We need to dismantle white supremacy. That needs to be a priority. We need to listen to indigenous voices. We need to work on land back and decolonization. We need to accept, especially those of us who are white like me, the role that we play in all these different forms of oppression. And we need to also be looking to our comrades in the developing world, in the rest of the world. I know that this video has been very America-centric, but big things are happening right now in South America, in India, all around the world. There are people paying attention to socialism right now in ways we haven't seen for a very long time. So please reach out as well as you are able in your local community. Try to keep an eye on what's going on globally, and let's start building a culture to supplant capitalist hegemony. In my next video, I plan on diving much deeper into ideology and hegemony and how these systems function. In the meantime, if you have any questions or ideas, feel free to leave a comment. You can also be mean to me if you want, but if you are abusive or a fascist, I will just hide you from the channel and you can scream into the void not knowing you've been shadow banned. This is the end of the video.
Bye-bye.
Newborn American babies, newborn citizens of these United States, free and with rights guaranteed by the Constitution. But let's take a closer look. These new arrivals in a typical American town have equal legal rights. In class, they are not equal at all. Each has a social status handed on to him by his family, ascribed to him at birth. Meet Guilford Ames III, the latest addition to one of the town's upper-class families. Guilford Ames II is the wealthiest man in town. He owns a large factory. David Benton, whose ascribed status is lower class. David's father is Michael Benton, an unskilled factory worker who has a meager education. Mr. Benton rents the upper floor of a two-family house in a rundown section of town. The ability to rise from an ascribed status to an achieved one is called vertical mobility and is particularly characteristic of the United States. There are class lines within each general group, and these vary geographically and in relation to nationality, religion, and race. Class exists in the United States as it does everywhere, and it plays a vital part in the life of every community.